Today, we're going to get this 1982 40 horse Mercury Outboard back together and see if it runs. This is the after-work garage. I already got the carburetor cleaned out and back on the block in a previous video. If you're curious, you can check it out here. So today, we're going to start with getting the impeller and the impeller housing changed and getting the lower unit put back on the motor. This is the impeller kit I purchased, and it's obviously an aftermarket kit, but it says it should be compatible with this motor, so we'll see. To the eye, it looks like the components are most of the same, but we'll go ahead and compare them. So the main parts that I see immediately that look the same are the impeller housing. So you can see our new housing doesn't have all the damage that the old one does, especially right around the shaft there. They look to be pretty much identical. Obviously got a new impeller, our old one was completely ruined. This does not have this piece right here, nor does it have this stopper thing, so we'll have to keep those. It does also have a plate and a stack of gaskets. Now looking at this, I thought this was just one unit, but it turns out it's actually a bunch of gaskets that are all fused together here. So it looks like the plates in the middle will orient the same way, with the little bend downs there. Looks like the holes all line up, which is definitely a good sign. And then I'm assuming one goes on top and one goes on the bottom. Oh, this one goes on top. And there we are, that one goes on the bottom. It does have this lower housing, so I'm going to go ahead and try to get the lower housing off of the lower unit that we have right there. Alright, so I'm going to try to gently pry up here on this plastic piece and see where that gets it. Ooh, this is like rubber here. Or on the exhaust port, I might have to be careful of that. It's moving a little bit, that's a good sign. Try to rock it back and forth a few times and maybe see if I can get some pliers on it. I see it wiggling around. I feel like it should be free. So I figured out why this was so difficult to get out. This bottom plate is actually the seal, the oil seal for the lower unit gear case. So down there you can see the drive shaft bearing and things that are usually have their own seal. And in this case, it's an integrated seal here. So you're fighting against that seal pulling it out. And the way I did that was I just took a little pry bar, stuck it in, and carefully, just very gently push up like this, well, after rocking it back and forth a little bit. And that seemed to be able to break the seal free. In addition, we can see that this gasket right here matches the gasket in our kit. So we can replace this as well. As you can see, it's pretty dirty in there where I removed that bottom plate. So the first thing I'm going to do is spray some brake clean in there and get those surfaces cleaned up where I'm going to install the new bottom part of the impeller housing and seal. I am, however, aware that this brake clean is going to get into the lower unit, and so we're going to have to change out the lower unit gear oil, just because we don't want this in there. It doesn't lubricate very well. Looks like that's about as clean as I'm going to get it. What I'm mainly concerned about is this inside surface here where there's a rubber gasket that goes down there and forms that seal. So here's the bottom part of the impeller housing and seal, and it sits here in the lower unit like this. They look pretty much identical, and you can see that this one has the studs in it already that I took out of the other one. To get this ready, looks like there's just an O-ring that goes around here, so let's go ahead and, I wonder why there's two of them. Let's go ahead and fit one of these in, see how it fits. That one looks like a pretty good fit there. So I'm just going to take some lower unit lube and lubricate the inside surface here and that surface there before I install it on the lower unit itself. It is a tight fit, and then I think it should press in. All right. It may help us here. It's like it's too big. It's like the plastic part's too big. Oh, the old one does the same thing. Okay, so the old one sucks just as much to get on, so it's just a problem of getting it on there. Oh boy.
I'll save you the saga of getting the lower impeller housing back in, but it's a really tight fit and there's not a great way to press it in. Tapping on it lightly with a hammer didn't work, and the threading on the studs doesn't go down far enough to just run the nuts all the way down and press it in. In addition, the studs aren't long enough to get the nuts started on the threading with either the upper impeller housing or the old lower housing on first as a spacer. In the end, I wound up using small sockets around each one of the studs as spacers so that I could use the nuts on the threads to press the new housing in place. Oh, and I did put a new paper gasket in place before installing all of this.
It wasn't pretty when we fought for all of it, but it looks like it's on. Alright, now onto these gaskets. So using the old gasket as a template here, the old bottom little sweep plate thing, this side was facing down, so we're just going to leave that there. And it looks like we have one gasket on the bottom, the metal plate, and then the gasket on the top that has the open hole in it. Let's go ahead and put this on. You know, I'm just going to check something. Because this old impeller was so hard to get off, I'm going to check to make sure the new one can get back on again. And it looks like it's going to be real difficult. So actually, instead of putting this in the housing first, you know, squishing it in here and then putting the whole thing down, I'm going to try to get this impeller on. And I see why. There's a little ridge here, and it looks intentional. So we're going to try to get it under that ridge first with the woodruff key. And so we're going to slide this guy down here. Boy, nothing's easy with this motor, is it? Nothing. Hey, there we go. Right. Whew, now let's put the housing on. Housing. Slides over this. Now to get it on the impeller, I'm just going to turn the shaft the way it turns, which is clockwise. And the battle's won. Look at that. Nice that they provided a cutout there for the socket. That's maybe the one easy thing they built into this. Okay, we have just a few more things to do. The first is to slide this little thing down onto the drive shaft. This is just a seal for the top of the water pump. Next, we have this little rubber piece here, and this is a seal that eventually sits down in here, and it seals water coming out from the water pump and makes sure it goes up into the engine, up the standpipe. But I'm actually going to set it on the standpipe, and this is this copper piece right here, so we will just fit that on. So when we put the lower unit back on, it'll slide back up into this piece. Next, we want to make sure this piece is on in the correct orientation. If you remember, it fell off while I was cleaning the lower unit off, and it is the reverse lock cam. So when you shift the motor into reverse, it locks the motor down to the bracket. This, I believe, is the correct orientation when we're in neutral, so you can see the propeller shaft here spins, but the drive shaft doesn't. And when this goes into forward, we have the drive shaft turning clockwise and the propeller shaft turning clockwise. And reverse is actually kind of hard for me to get into by hand. But if we were to put it in reverse, we can see the cam would bump over and push the rod up. So I think this is the proper position for neutral. While we're talking about shifting components, this is a little plastic piece that I didn't quite know what it did. It fell out of when I took the lower unit off. Looking at the leg of the motor, we can see that we have the reverse lock push rod here. This gets pushed up to lock the motor to the bracket. And then we have our shift linkage back in here. It's kind of hard to see, it's pretty dark, but this piece sits up here and grabs, this is like impossible to do, grabs that push rod and keeps it in place around the shift linkage. Okay, so I had to use two hands to get it seated all the way in there, but this is that little black plastic piece that we were just talking about, and the shift linkage is right there in the middle, and the push rod for the reverse lock is right there. So we're all seated up there nice and happy.
Before reinstalling the lower unit, there's two small spline pieces that you're going to want to make sure aren't still stuck up in the motor. When you pull the lower unit out, they have a tendency to slide off the end of the drive shaft and stay in the leg, in which case you'll have to fish them out with a curved pick or some sort of grabber thing.
So I brought the lower unit over here just because I wanted to show what these little pieces were that fell out of the leg in the motor. There's this hard plastic one and this squishy rubber one, and they're supposedly drive shaft spline seals. And the hard plastic one goes on first, and as you can see, there's only splines on half of it, and so the side with splines goes up, and those splines will stop it when it gets down here. And then this rubber one only has splines on the smaller end, but it goes wider end down and slides down onto the other collar. While reattaching this Speedo tube, I discovered that there's just a plug in here. So normally what happens is there's a little hole in the front of the lower unit, and the water pressure here creates air pressure in the Speedo tube hose, and that then feeds the speedometer and tells you how fast you're going. But in this case, this hose just looks like a dummy hose, so if you wanted to add a speedometer, you could add one, but in this case, there's just a plug in here. Looks like there should be a hole in that, but there's not. Getting the lower unit back in definitely takes some lining up and maneuvering. If it's not going in, don't force it. Just take it out and try lining it up again. I will also note that the exhaust tube in this motor is held in place by the lower unit, and it seems to fall down and rattle around while you're trying to put things back in, so it can take a bit to get lined up. In addition, I removed the dummy Speedo tube connector to make alignment a little bit easier. Now that the lower unit's on, let's go ahead and work on getting the top of the motor back together. So I've done something extremely stupid, and this is the fuel barb here, and I snapped it off. As you can see, completely broken. I was tilting the motor up, and it hit the wooden part here and just completely snapped off. So I'm gonna have to take that apart, see about getting a new one of those. Let's see, this whole unit comes off. And then this, it looks like, is held down by these things and screws in there. So why don't we undo those bolts and see what we got. So I'm over here taking off these fuel lines, and they're really seized on there. So I'm gonna end up cutting them. But I'm gonna have to get new fuel lines here, and obviously a new one of the whatever this is. Which sucks, because I'm hoping they still make it. So now to address this piece that I broke off, this is just a fuel barb, and it fits into the Mercury Quick Connect that was used on those old motors. Now I've ordered a used one because these are actually pretty expensive. They're like over 50 bucks. So I picked this one up significantly cheaper, but we're going to take it apart. Looks like this little pin in here, which is this, is a little rusted on this one. So not only am I going to take that out and replace it with the innards of this guy, but I'm also going to make sure I'm putting it back together in the correct orientation. Definitely don't want to break the new one. That would be terrible. So let's look how this is put together. There's this ring, and then the wide end of the spring, and then it goes onto the pin. Like that. If we look in there. Before I get too far into this, I am replacing this fuel line. I bought a new fuel line, and I'm just going to go ahead and measure it real quick to make sure I have at least enough here. So that looks about good. I'm actually going to curve this tube up so we're not fighting its natural spring, because it has to go around the starter motor and then back up again. Next is getting this fuel barb back in. That's back together. So see, we have that fuel hookup back in place there, and just to show you how it works, on the outside there's this part protruding, and we have this handle, and this just this would be attached to the hose coming from your gas tank, and you stick it in there and turn, and now you have gas to your motor. And at the end of the day, you can unhook it. So it's just a quick connect. Reassembly of the front support and wiring harness is just the reverse of disassembly. Just make sure you reconnect all the ground wires and route the wires where they were so they aren't in the way of the flywheel.
Oh, and the choke solenoid wire is a lot easier to connect before the front plate's bolted down.
Next thing we're going to do is change out the lower unit oil, because remember we got all that brake clean and stuff in there, and we just need to get some fresh oil in now that the motor's back together. So the weather's working for us and it's quite pretty out, so I'm going to go ahead and test this motor out, see if it runs. First thing I'm going to do is change out this newer style fuel hookup with the older style fuel barb here. Alright, we've got the motor in some water here and it's hooked up to a battery and some fuel, so we're about to see if it runs. But since we don't have any controls, we're not going to be able to just turn it on with an ignition. So I'm going to jump the positive lead on the battery to this nut right here to turn it over, just like we did for the compression test. And we're not going to be able to turn it off either with a key or a kill switch. So once it gets going, I'm just going to use the choke to cut off its air supply, and hopefully that'll get it turned off when we want to turn it off. If not, we can always take off the spark plug boots. That's a little riskier because there's some stray current flying around, and if I was more prepared, I would wire up a kill switch to ground out the ignition, but I didn't do that. So let's see what we got. Alright, I really wanted to there for a sec. I'm going to let the starter motor cool down. I'll be right back. They started doing some yard work next to me and it got a little loud, so I'm going to sum things up here. Got the motor running and it was a little hard to start, but once it got going it seemed to be okay. And obviously there's some things that need to be adjusted, like the mixture and the idle speed, but more worrisome to me is that the block itself was getting pretty warm after running it for a while. And it was getting warmer than I would expect it to get if there were water running through it. Now, even though the telltale, that stream of water coming out of the motor, was really strong, which I would expect it to be since we just put a new impeller kit in the motor, the block was getting really warm, which suggests to me that there's either a blockage in the cooling passage or that the thermostat and poppet valve are seized shut. So I'm definitely going to have to look into that. It also became pretty apparent that the fuel pump wasn't working, since the motor would die when it had exhausted the fuel in the carburetor bowl. Now, this could be fixed by me manually pumping the bulb from the fuel tank, which is a classic sign of a bad fuel pump. And this isn't a big deal. I probably should have replaced the fuel pump anyways, but it does mean that this is going to be part 2 of a 3-part series on this motor. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will catch you next time on the After Work Garage.